Hello and welcome back to another episode of Coffee Wednesday, and this is the part of our show where we get to talk about different ways to bring back the joy as well as the pleasure of reading and self-education into your life. And in today's episode, we're going to give you a very practical two-phased plan or two components to build a very clean and simple daily reading routine. So a lot of people out there, they think of reading routines as like, oh, I got to set this up right or I got to set that up right. But in fact, you only need two things to really construct a really consistent reading routine. So if you're a kind of person who finds it difficult to stay consistent, if you find it really difficult to find a reason to get up and read every morning, and if you struggle with this question of like, how long should I read every single day? Well, today's episode is going to help you clarify a lot of those questions and hopefully leave you with something that you can walk away with. So before we start today's episode was based on a newsletter, especially a segment called Want to Read, where every Saturday I send out a free newsletter covering a lot of the stuff that we cover on this channel. Building a consistent reading routine, of course, getting deeper with your reading, and of course, reading something up to the point where you can use it as a tool for exploration and inspiration, all that and more, where every Saturday you get one of these free letters, and for paid members, there's an extra letter on Monday. So if you're interested to receive these updates, if you're interested to see what I'm working on, and in fact, I'm working on a really exciting workshop that I'm going to bring out at the end of November for you guys. So if you want those kinds of updates, as well as these reading advice, and self-education advice, make sure to sign up for a free subscription over at www.amugofinsights.org for all these goodies coming to you. And I'm really excited to talk more about the workshop as we get closer to the release date. So stay tuned for that. And without further ado, today's episode, let's talk about the two components of a consistent reading habit. So back when I posted that episode about how I consistently read 5 to 6 books every single month. So I got this really clever comment that basically said, the only way to really read 6 books a month is by sitting around and doing nothing but reading. But in my experience, that's just blatantly not true because besides reading and creating these podcast episodes and besides everything that I do in my life that has something to do with reading, sometimes I feel like I can't get away from it, I also do a bunch of other things. Like I practice martial arts 3-4 times a week. In fact, I'm going up for my, yellow belt grading really soon, in a week or so, in a week or two. And also, I write a lot to script these videos, and of course to gather inspiration, to gather ideas, so that I have something to talk about and write about every single week. And of course, I produce one of these episodes every week. So given that I have a lot of stuff on my calendar, and given that, I am running a full-time production company here, or a full-time media company here, how is it the case that I still manage to squeeze in so much reading into my life? And how could you use the same principles to secure reading into your life as a permanent fixture that is not incompatible with the rest of your life? Because the common consensus here is that if you ever want to get into reading, you better put your calendar on pause and you better send out an email saying, I'm out of office for the next 3 months. I'm going to go live in a cave and read for 6 hours a day. But that's not most of our lives. Most people assume that to really build reading into your life, or to really build a consistent reading habit, that it demands some sort of drastic action. It demands some sort of overhaul of your time, because reading, God, it's going to take up so much of my time. But realistically, you only need 2 things to really build a consistent reading habit, and these 2 things, most of us can find them, and most of us can build this into our lives. So the 2 things are interest plus routine. So interest plus routine. So let's start with interest. So the interest part is the part that most of us tend to screw up without knowing about it. And it is so obvious that a lot of us tend to not look at it. And halfway through our month, we find ourselves reading nothing because we have not covered or uncovered this first problem that we have to overcome called interest. If you can bring back some memories of you reading a novel for English class, the education system really programmed us to only read things that we hate, or to, in a sense, associate reading with a series of really unpleasant images, really unpleasant practices where we think to ourselves, reading is just bleeding our eyes out over dead wood. So you were forced to read a novel, you were forced to read this academic article, or you were forced to produce an essay on something that you've read. So in a sense, a lot of us have built up this unconscious association that reading is supposed to be full of effort. It's supposed to be me with a chisel, trying to find out the best pieces of knowledge. If you have a slab of marble, which is the book, you're trying to chisel out the best bits from that marble. So over time, this strenuous or this really effortful association gets so ingrained into our minds that we physically find it impossible to read anything that we enjoy. And if we do have certain nascent ideas about what we like to read, automatically in our brains, we tend to categorize it into not serious reading. I'm really into vampire novels. Not me personally, but I'm just saying if someone's really interested in vampire novels, automatically that somehow gets swept under the rug as not serious reading. So of course, it's really easy for us to overlook interest because we do have this fear of like, what if one day I'm just stuck reading the same genre over and over and over again? What if one day we don't actually get to practice the skill of reading? And this fear is what gets us to read something that's way beyond our skill levels. And this fear is something that keeps us stuck in the stage where we get to only view reading as something that takes an extreme amount of effort. So the idea here is that, first of all, you need to start reading something that you're interested in. You need to begin with something that you can handle, and you need to begin with something that brings back that interesting reading, because chances are we've had certain episodes in our lives where we're totally brought into the idea of reading. You read one book and it suddenly blows up your whole world. You read one novel when you're trying to escape from your bullies in a high school library, and you think to yourself, this is the best form of escapism there is. And the beautiful thing as adults is that it only takes one experience or one positive reading experience to completely reassociate your relationship with reading. So that usually comes in a form of reading something you already like. And first of all, you need to build the interest. You need to build this muscle. If you want to rebuild the ability of reading, you have to start from something that you like. You have to let go of this idea of that there's serious reading out there that I must read. Because if you approach it from a place of ego and pride, if you can't let yourself read or get interested in what you're genuinely interested in, and if you can't get rid of that association of pain equals reading, you can never move forward with a consistent reading habit, because every time when you pick up a book, that's what you expect. So our recommendation here is that start from an easier level of reading and tuning to your interests completely. Do you have a nascent interest in dinosaurs? Do you love reading journalism from the magazine? Or do you love reading certain genres of fiction? Start with that, because chances are the routine itself will eventually build up the reading skills necessary for you to challenge more challenging material. Whereas if you reach for the challenging material from the get-go, you're likely going to burn out, and the old association between pain and reading will likely resurface. So that's the point with interest, and keep in mind, it only takes about one positive experience with a book for you to completely change your mind about this whole reading thing. So first, we need to work on our association through introducing interesting books in our lives, and this takes the form of taking yourself out to a bookstore for a bookstore date by yourself. Pick up like 2 to 3 titles that you find interesting, or download 2 to 3 Kindle samples of books that you find interesting. Read them. Just pay attention to how you feel. Do you want to keep going? If not, put the book down, move on to something else. And that is our step 1, or phase 1 of building a very consistent reading routine. You gotta break the association. And phase 2 to building a really consistent reading habit is routine. So whenever I say routine, people think of like cold showers. People think of morning saunas. People think of jumping into a pool of cold water, because we are living in this exhibitionist culture. So it's not enough for us just to do what works for us. Same with reading books. We like to exhibit something impressive that we have read instead of just enjoying the process itself. Same with routines. A lot of routines are saturated with this romantic image of the hyper-productive person. And a lot of routines are needlessly complex. There's no reason why you should wake up at 5 a.m. and then do like 10 things before you even get down to breakfast. And there's no reason why to keep yourself trapped in some arbitrary standards where if I don't complete these steps, I'm going to die. So that response needs to be interrogated. And for our reading routine here, instead of thinking about this really elaborate thing that you're going to build, we're going to focus on trivializing reading. And the reason why trivializing a routine really works is because if you really think about it, it doesn't really take that long every day to read for you to read an impressive amount of reading material every single month. So a little thought experiment here. If you want to read 3 books a month, and if you're consistent with it, you realistically only need to read about 30 pages. And of course, people don't really like to hear that. Really? Is it a case that I just get to read 30 pages a day and that amounts to something great at the end of the month? Yes, because 30 times 30 is 900. That is probably the length of a really impressive novel. And that's probably 3 books back to back, 300 pages, and that's a considerable amount of reading done every single month. But see, because we're in this exhibitionist kind of culture, we don't like a small goal every day. And we don't really like this idea of like, oh, I can't show off 30 pages a day, but I can show off 50 pages a day or can show up 100 pages a day. So inevitably, we get into this dead cycle of trying to show off one day and burn out. Not read for 2-3 days and I read another 50 pages and burn out again without reading for another 4 days. So our record is really patchy. And a paradox here is that the sexier your daily routine looks, or daily reading routine looks, the more impressive it sounds, the less likely you'll be able to keep it up in the long term. And the less likely you'll be able to really build it into your life, because life, most of the time, it's mundane. Most of the time, it's trivial. And what you need to do is to level your reading habit into that plane of triviality. And the best way to do this is by attaching this moment of trivial reading with something that you already do. Do you make a coffee at 8 a.m. every morning? Why don't you get 10 pages in right then and there? Do you find yourself on a boring commute to work that's about an hour? Just put on an audiobook. Do you find yourself on a run every morning? Why don't you read right after your run for 15 minutes? So see, we don't like those goals because they don't sound as sexy as I was in my study for 2 to 3 hours, reading my eyeballs out for 3 hours. But if you're willing to let go of the pride and ego contained in your fancy reading routine, what you're getting in exchange is a very steady flow or a very steady sense of calm where you say to yourself, yes, I've done my daily chunk. Now it's time to move on to doing other things. Yes, I've done my daily goal, and now it's time for me to focus on other areas of my life. And a tragedy with a lot of people with really robust reading routines is that eventually they'll start to realize that this 3-hour reading routine is distracting them from working on something else. And my approach here is really going to help you interrogate what are you avoiding in your life that you're using reading to cover up. And if you know in your heart of hearts that you can't get all your reading done with only 20 to 30 pages a day, you will think twice about a lot of the things that we've talked about here. You think twice about some other areas of your life that you really want to work on. You think twice about, diversifying your interests so that you're not only using reading as a crutch. And of course, ultimately, you rethink your approach to building reading into your life. It is not supposed to be as painful as it seems. It's not supposed to be as impressive as it seems. Readers are just ordinary people. Readers are ordinary people, have a different way of processing information, and they have a daily practice that doesn't take that long to do. And it is doable for most people. It is very exciting for a lot of people to implement this in their lives and realizing that they too have the capacity to do this kind of like super act of reading a lot in a single month. And of course, over time, this routine will start to snowball. You find yourself reading more and more difficult material. You find yourself not only reading 30 pages a day, you find yourself reading 100 pages a day effortlessly. And as the snowball builds, one day you will become one of those really annoying people who can't shut up about books and reading. So a quick summary here. There are 2 components that you need to build a very consistent and boring reading habit. Number 1 is interest. Find experiences with books that are going to break that association between pain, effort, and reading. Remember that there's always more time later down the track for you to practice your reading skills to tackle more difficult material. But for the time being, you need to focus on breaking that association. And number 2, you need consistency. Pair reading with some trivial activities that you already do, and do not make your daily routine too sexy or too complicated. In most cases, 20 to 30 pages is more than enough for you to read an impressive amount in a given month. And our recommendation here is that do not read for more than 2 to 3 hours in any given day. Because if you read beyond that level, chances are you're not working on some other areas of your life and you're trying to use ideas as escapism, which is something that we don't want to do here. So anyway, that's all I have for this week's episode. Hope you guys have enjoyed a fairly practical guide to how to get back into reading, because a lot of the times, readers are really cagey about their practices. Readers tend to treat reading as this almost like a religious exercise, which makes sense because reading has historically a religious root. And of course, our goal here is to break the myth of the reader and to give you all the tools you need so that one day you can go around and explore really interesting subjects by yourself. We're going to arm you with the techniques and, of course, the mindsets that you need to really get in touch with the joy and the pleasure of reading and self-education. So then again, Rob Walden here. We will be back here next Wednesday for more quick and practical tips for how to bring reading into your life. Rob Walden here. Take care. I'll see you next Wednesday. Goodbye.